you're going to have to talk about maybe offensive or uncomfortable content.
Compensation information is not confidential ever.
The obligation of the manager is to communicate that to the employee and to say, this isn't going well. Here's how it needs to happen, or you need to stop doing that behavior, whatever that is. Do you have questions? How can I help you?
In the absence of expectation, people write their own narrative. So job descriptions are like the first thing an employee generally sees about the company.
Welcome to the Cincinnati Business Podcast, where we give you practical tips and tricks to grow yourself and your business. And brought to you by the Cincinnati Podcast Studio. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Cincinnati Business Podcast. Again, I'm your host, Brian Erickson. Glad to have you around today because we're talking about something that is probably not thought of first when you're starting a business, but definitely should be thought of as you start to grow your business. And so with me today, I've got the team from HR Elements, part of the team from HR Elements, Jamie and Warren. Welcome to the studio. Glad you're here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I've got so many questions about HR and all that sort of stuff because I'm just so curious. But I want to start with tell me a little bit. One of you guys want to tell me this story a little bit about what is HR Elements? How do you guys work? Because you're not like the classic firm kind of way. You're almost more like a, I want to say fractional HR person.
Absolutely.
So yeah, fill me in. What's going on with it?
So at HR Elements, we are right now just about, I think, over getting ready to hire more than our 12th employee. So we have been local to Cincinnati for over 10 years. And when our founder, Tina Taylor, started the business, she was looking for a way to make a difference in the local business community, knew that a lot of smaller or private businesses, family-owned businesses, didn't always have that right dedicated level of HR expertise. And so she created this business model where not only are we fractional providers, but we are HR experts. Our least tenured person on the team, I think, has 14 years of HR experience.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Many of us have been VPs, directors, HR business partners, and we're all employees of the company, so we don't sub out any work. And all of us have our senior SHRM certification,
Nice.
Which means we've had to pass a pretty robust test to say that we, in fact, know what we're doing.
Cool. Okay. So one of the things that you guys were saying to me when you guys first came in today, that you also work as interim HRs while people are maybe trying to find a new head of HR or something like that. How does that work?
Yeah. So sometimes a client might have a director of HR that, has a medical leave, has a baby, or resigns. Maybe they retire and they need somebody to fill in for a while to kind of keep things moving. So one of our advisors, like Warren, will go and sit on site in their office, fill in that person's shoes while they're gone so that employees and managers within the company still have all of the access and support they need, but also for that either future HR permanent hire or the person who's maybe out on leave and is coming back doesn't come back to a mess. They come back to something that was well cared for while they were gone.
Awesome. Okay. So now I don't know anything about HR at all. So this is really interesting for me to just ask a bunch of questions. Now, is there such a thing as specialties inside of HR? Do you guys have specialties that you guys like to focus on when you do your work?
Oh, absolutely. So I think employee relations is what most people think of when you talk about human resources. And that's when you're working with someone to bring them on site, to introduce them to the culture of the company, to make an initial introduction to their supervisor. That's part of the training process. It's also when employees have an issue at their employer and they have to talk to somebody about it. They need some kind of counseling on how to address a concern with their supervisor. That's a very common entry point for what people think of HR to be. We also, and very commonly, what people don't really think of HR as is a lifeline and a right hand to the CEO or the chief individual on staff or the owner, especially for a smaller organization, which is a very common type of setup that we have. Smaller organizations often, as we were talking about with fractional HR, often don't have the resources necessary to have a full-time HR person. And so a lot of times your CEO or someone else on the C-suite or whatever exists there is taking on a lot of those responsibilities.
Yeah.
So those outside of what we talked about before are training, payroll, compensation research, benefits, any other kind of professional development that might come into play, discipline, terminations. I'm sure I'm missing several things as we're talking about them, but it's as you're growing your organization, you just don't realize how much of a monster it can become. And so that is where we are able to come in handy the most for those growing organizations that need to keep things flowing and keep the business right.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things that I started to learn that I was so deficient in when I started to get higher up in organizations. I was like,
Yeah.
I don't even know if I'm like allowed to ask this question in an interview, but I'm going to try it anyway and like see what happens, see if I get in trouble. Like there's so many things that it feels like HR has to understand laws and regulations around business that I feel like most people don't understand. Like if you guys were to say like, what are some of the common like pitfalls that somebody runs into that you guys have seen when they don't understand HR?
Ooh, that's a great question. So common pitfalls, I think that the biggest kind of, I'll call it a well-intentioned mistake, is from a manager who has an employee come to them and is like, oh, I'm sick or I'm not feeling well. I'm having some kind of issue and I'm going to the doctor for it, right? As most human beings are like, oh my gosh, we want to help you. Are you okay? What can I do? But then we have to remember we're at work. We're an employer. There are laws that have come into play here. There's ADA, there's HIPAA, there's all these different things, right? So we don't want to ask certain questions, but we also need to make sure that we say, okay, people think about papers and forms every time they think of HR, but the reason is because we need to know how to keep that person safe. We need to know what exactly is going on in a way that doesn't maybe tell all about their diagnoses to their hiring manager or their colleagues that could cause some issues, and then provide that person with the right amount of time off. There's a whole FMLA overlay sometimes. There could be workers' comp. There could be benefits issues, leave of absence. I mean, there's so many different kind of like layers to just that situation. I had an employee once, this is many years ago, where he was having a lot of attendance issues. And his supervisor it was a store location, wanted to help, found out that this person was having some alcohol challenges. And some of their days off were because they were in like the hospital, right? For being, I don't know, getting some medical attention for drinking too much. And instead of reporting it, the manager wanted to just kind of help this employee through it. But what people don't always realize is that, that's a disease. Then now we have, ADA, we have some things that we needed to work through. And it really just snowballed into this monster issue because the manager didn't know enough about how to properly handle the situation.
And then probably the documentation and other things like that would be needed for down the road if the employee couldn't perform anymore or stuff like that. That was not there.
And even if you think about like somebody who maybe has an injury or they have some type of medical situation that occurs and maybe they're not able to perform the job in the same way that they did pre-incident, right? There's this whole ADA accommodation interactive process where there are very certain questions that you ask. And again, thinking back to people usually are acting with the right intentions, right? I want to help my employee. I want to help my coworker. But what I see all the time is that instead of saying, what do you need in order to meet, the job requirements or how can we help you? It's, well, how about we give you X, Y, and Z and do this, this, and this to your job? And the manager's tending to make accommodations that is not part of what we should be doing at all.
Interesting.
And these legal requirements start from the moment you have your first interactions with the employee. through that recruitment process, when you're screening an employee, when you're reviewing their resume. I think a very common pitfall, especially at the beginning, is asking questions in an interview or a phone screen that are just not related to the job. Right?
Mhm.
That's the rule of thumb. When you're talking to an employee, really, when you're talking to employees, kind of ever, you want to be friendly with them and you want to have a bond. But generally, your conversations need to stay related to performance and related to the role. So we don't want to be asking questions of employees about their age, their race, their gender, protected classes. A very common one I think people are prone to talking about is their family status
Mhm.
and kids and things like that. It's just stay away from it. It's not a conversation to be having when you're first talking to someone, interviewing with someone. We want to keep the focus on the job. So there are a lot of legal implications and things that can come into play when we're not maintaining that focus from the get-go.
Well, so tell me, like, what's the downside? Like, say you have some of those conversations in the interview. Like, what is there to stop someone from having those conversations?
So, right. So the employee that you're interviewing might bring up they've got kids, and they might bring up that they have a spouse, and they might
Mhm.
talk about their family situation. What we would tell HR professionals is, if they choose to talk about that, that is fine. Don't write it down. Don't pry. Don't pursue it. Don't ask follow-up questions about it. The issue that can arise is that if you are engaging in that discussion and you've made a decision to maybe not hire that person could, if they're litigious, come back and say, you made this decision about my hire based on the fact that I've got a kid. You don't think I can do the job. You don't think I've got the time. Those kinds of things. That's not the route we want to take. And especially comes into play, a woman who's pregnant, who's interviewing, right? They're trying to get out of hiring someone who they know is going to have to take some kind of leave at some point. And we cannot make those kinds of decisions. So that's really when it
That
comes
makes
into play,
sense.
that down the line
Yeah.
litigiousness. And the employee would have the right to do that if they chose to do it. We want to do what we can to ensure that everyone feels like whatever decision was made is the right one, and truly that the decision that was made is the right one.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So then what is the worst example you guys have run into in that sort of situation where someone did ask a bad question or something like that, or a potential hire came back and sued? Like what has happened that you guys have seen in that space?
I'm gonna just knock gently on this wooden table here because I have been very lucky, and I've not had a scenario where a candidate who wasn't selected for the position has filed any type of
Nice.
suit. I have, however, seen, and I accidentally did it myself once, where you're just trying to calm the candidate down, make a little bit of small talk, or you see a common thread, right? How often do you maybe see a resume when you're in an interviewing situation and, oh, I went to that college. Hey, when did you graduate? Because you want to share, right? You want to talk about the common bond. And so I had a manager who was interviewing somebody to actually join her team. We also were in HR, and the person had gone to the same high school and made that comment. Or a situation that I did was I had one interview with the person and no cast on arm, right? The second interview, they came in and it was like this big giant blue cast. Oh my God, what happened? Right? Like, what happened to you? Not because I'm like, can you type? Can you carry things? Can you do your job? It was like, oh my gosh, you've experienced some type of injury since the last time I talked to you. Are you okay? Tell me your story. But again, not allowed to ask that. Not supposed to ask those things.
I've never had a situation like that either, thank God. However, I do remember very clearly when I first started at a company, I had a manager who was interviewing a candidate tell the candidate after we shared what the compensation range was, what the pay range was, that this is confidential. You cannot share it. Compensation information is not confidential ever. So that is a There's a provision in Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act. Employees are able to share with others information about their compensation, their working conditions, and their terms of employment. So if an employee went online and blasted, I make this much money and my employer, it doesn't have safe practices, and here's an example of it, and they blasted it all over the internet, they could technically do that. Right. So that's another legal implication that perhaps less seasoned HR professionals might get into hot water with.
Yeah.
Extremely common. We've seen a lot of handbooks that say that compensation is confidential. And it's like, oh, no, it is not.
Yeah.
No, it is not at all. And so we're often doing a lot of training there. And a lot of people get caught by surprise that that's the case. So we as HR professionals, it's our responsibility to work with the employer to control the narrative. So what you do is it's best practice to just share up front. This is what the pay ranges are for these roles. And I've actually gone as far as to post many of those positions and their pay ranges publicly so that people see it. And we're getting ahead of the narrative. We're not letting the lack of information affect the ability for us to have a positive working relationship with the employee.
Yeah. Clarity is king.
Yeah.
Whenever you
It's
can give
challenging. It's
Yeah.
scary.
It is.
You have to be vulnerable. And I've gone through things like that firsthand where I've seen the night and day effect of doing it. And sometimes it's really challenging for us as HR pros to convince C-suite or to convince the president, owner, CEO that this is the right path to take. Because again, it can be scary to be that vulnerable.
It is scary.
Yeah.
People are going to ask some hard questions.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, so then here's a hard question for you then. There is what feels like a culture among the employees at large that they view HR as the rules people. The people who aren't allowed to have fun. The stodgy ones, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like, how do you guys fight against that space and try to represent? Because I know you guys both to be fun people. So like, I get that. Like, I feel like it would drive you guys nuts if you were just the rules people all the time. So
bonkers. Absolutely bonkers. Yes.
So like, what do you guys do, and how do you coach people to actively try to remove that label off of HR and try and make it a more friendly, welcoming place?
And I think it started, right, when you think back to the beginning, right, of that fabulous department personnel. And it was the pink slips and the timesheets. And it really, HR started as a function of making sure people got paid, right? And as our entire work style, our industry, our government has changed for many, many years, HR has absolutely changed from just a function that wasn't really a true strategic partner to being a person that sits at that seat at the table.
Yep.
So, we're as a group, right? SHRM or HR professionals, right? We are typically, pictured as like the librarian or the police officer. And I think it really comes down to what is that impression that you make when you're, meeting with employees? How are you building those relationships? How are you consistently adding value and being a true business partner to the leaders, to the different business unit owners? And I think it's also a little bit about how the culture of the organization is set up to really provide access to an HR team. I've had situations where people are like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know you could help me with this." Yeah. I didn't know you knew about this stuff. Or, "Oh my gosh, like, thanks for sitting in at my team meeting. Can you keep doing that?" Because we're just able to help facilitate different things based off of other partnerships we have in the organization. At HR Elements, we always say, we're not the principal. We're not a party planner. We are a strategic business partner to you, and now let us show you how. And frequently that happens. But I think it all starts with building the relationship.
Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah. Access and presence are really critical.
For sure.
If I'm going into an organization, or previous employers, I've met as many people as I possibly could, pick their brains. What brought you here? What is it that you like about being here? I
Mhm.
like to really understand what are the strengths that the organization has, and what is making people happy and what's making them feel a spark when they're working. Because those are things that I can play on and connect with as I continue to build relationships. So that conversation with the employee is not just social time. It becomes twofold. I'm building a very quick, trusting rapport with an employee and letting them know that I'm a human and someone you can reach out to and talk to, whether it's about, um, you know, changing your direct deposit or this major concern about how you're going to have this really challenging conversation with
Mhm.
your employee or your supervisor. So that and those initial discussions uh, are so critical for the employee to feel like I have someone that I can chat to and confide
Mhm.
in. Now, where that becomes challenging, right, is that we are advocates for our employees. We're also advocates for the employer,
Mhm.
right? So as Jamie
Well,
said,
that
we're
was the
strategic
question I
business
was about to
Yeah.
partners.
ask.
It
Yeah.
is a balancing act,
Yeah.
right? I've worked with several clients where I I I have actively known there are things I need to advocate for with this particular employee that may not necessarily be in the best interest of the employer and
Mm.
vice versa.
Mhm.
And you, best practice is putting the cards out on the table to the individuals that you're working with and saying
Mhm.
this is what I can do and this is what I can't do. So as Jamie mentioned before, setting expectation for access is critical so people know like I can have this discussion with you. I sense when an employee is coming forward and is maybe about to share a story about a harassment or discrimination or something like that,
Mhm.
and I tend to kind of stop the conversation before we go forward and say, I just want you to be aware. I can promise you discretion, but I can't promise confidentiality. So as we're moving forward in this discussion, I want to advocate for you as best as I can. I also have a fiduciary duty to the strategy of my company. So I just want you to hear
Mhm.
all of that before we move forward. I don't want that to be a deterrent, but I don't want you to feel like you're going to come to me in confidence and share something that I can just sit on because I can't.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
glad you brought that up because I
It,
do think
that's
people
hard.
really, it is hard. People don't understand. They expect slash demand confidentiality. And we do frequently have to say, we can only provide that to a certain extent. But at the end of the day,
Mhm.
we are here. HR as a function, again, is here to provide, results that are in the best interest of the business. But that means we're here to make sure employees are able to perform their job well. They're being treated
Mm.
appropriately. They have clarity. They have access. Because if all of those things are in play, the business should be doing very, very well.
Yeah.
But it is a misunderstanding, right? You're HR, you're supposed to just be here to advocate for me. You're a human resources person.
Yeah.
Okay. To an extent.
Yeah. Well, during that whole, I want to say it was kind of late COVID, the rise of the anti-work
Mhm.
conversation
Mhm.
that happened. One of the things that was often common said was HR protects the company, not the employees.
Right.
And I think that's while that is true, I don't think it puts you guys in the best of light because you guys are there to try and help the employees work better together
Mhm.
and to help them actually thrive in the space that
That's
they're
right.
in.
It
Yeah.
really is both, right? So
Yeah.
we're protecting the company, but we're also protecting the employee. So as Jamie said
Yeah.
before, if you've got an employee that is FMLA qualifiable and is allowed to take that 12 weeks of time off, we ensure that the employer is allowing that to happen. So
Mhm.
in that case, we're very much the advocate for the employee. And
Mhm.
Mhm.
FMLA is not in the best it's not in the best interest of the company short term. It is in the best
Bottom
interest of
lines. Yeah, that makes
right,
sense. Yeah.
but it is in the best interest of the company long term. Like you following, what is legally necessary and also offering the opportunity for employees, especially really strong ones, to have a family and to take time off
Mhm.
because you're ill or had a surgery or whatever. It is a way to like comply with policy and legality, but also to show that you care
Yeah.
about the employee. Like, hey, we care about you. We recognize you've got this thing going on in your personal life because that happens, right?
Mhm.
And we're going to allot this to you, and we might go above and beyond what's legally required and even help
Mhm.
pay for some of that or provide disability insurance or something along that line. And so in that sense, HR is very much an advocate for the employee. So it is
Yeah.
both, and it can shift and be different at different times and depending on the scenario. And that's where it becomes challenging and where we can be both we can be perceived as the good guy and the bad guy, but
Mhm.
in reality, we're all just trying to, um, you know, build a business and make the world go round.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes we're the only ones in the organization who might know what an employee is really going through,
Yeah.
what they've got going
Mhm.
on, what if they're out on leave, maybe they're going through cancer treatment, but they don't want people to know, but we know. So sometimes we're the only one that's able to say, how are you
Mhm.
feeling? What do you need?
Mhm.
And that is, that's very personal. That is something where we want to be able to help support and be that person if there's a struggle, if there's a challenge. They will frequently seek out the person sitting in that HR seat to get guidance or suggestions. I'm having a hard time with my manager. What do you think I should do?
Mm.
Those are conversations that we'll talk about with them. We'll role play to figure out, let's practice a conversation. Let's
Role
figure this out. Yes.
And I
Yes.
like that too, because, and I've done this with employees before, and it's a learning curve,
Mhm.
especially for employees that you're coming for. I get so happy when they come forward, not that there's an issue, but that they come forward to ask about how do I best approach this situation, because they have not only their own interests are, but also their supervisor's interests are. They just want to make it work
Mhm.
and they want to be effective in their roles. And so I'm really genuinely happy when they come forward and share how can I best, mitigate this issue and
Mhm.
come to a conclusion for how we can move forward. Because it means that the employee wants to play an active role in their success.
Yeah.
And that, I think that's kind of one of the more fun things we get to do in
Mhm.
HR,
Yeah.
is to be able to help that employee navigate and give them the confidence to build a relationship in a complex sort of dynamic.
Yeah. So then here's another layer then to my questions, because when I think about things like as a business owner, I start to think about things like corporate structures and how am I reporting myself to the IRS and other
Mhm.
things like that. And one of the things that is often a conversation is like, how are you getting taxed as like a C or an S corp? And when you start to enter those spaces, you got to have a thing called payroll. And when I was not as well versed in my journey
Mhm.
as a business person, an entrepreneur, whatever I'm supposed to call myself now, um, I would have guessed that payroll was a function of an accounting service versus a HR
Mhm.
thing. Why is it under the purview of HR versus?
So I'd say it's half and half, right?
Mhm.
Mhm.
I like payroll to live in accounting. And the reason that I like it is because that way we have nice checks and balances, right?
Mhm.
That person who is processing payroll is going to be probably really more familiar with just accounting regulations and that it can fit in nicely to that job. But then we think about from an HR perspective, we are looking at the benefits deductions. We're making sure that enrollment was done on time, that things have been entered properly. If somebody gets a pay change, we're putting it in.
Mm.
But then we're not also running the payroll,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I think just from a compliance perspective or fairness equity, I like that balance of duties. But very frequently, again, think about a small business or a private business where you don't have enough work for one person in accounting to come in and do payroll. It needs to be a shared resource.
Yeah.
And that's where we're seeing it happen more and more often, where if the first thing an employee is going to want when you hire them is to get paid. So if you
Yeah.
can't do that properly and on time and in a way that's going to continue to build confidence with that employee, then you might as well stop because they're going to quit. They're done.
Yeah.
And so the key to, success with payroll when you're also not an accountant, but you might be the HR person who is responsible for doing it all, is having a really good vendor.
Mhm.
HR's got a lot of really solid vendor relationships. HR Elements has a lot of really great vendor relationships. We've got wonderful payroll companies that we get to recommend to our clients.
Mhm.
We, as Jamie said, we're not accountants. We are not benefits experts. We're not brokers. We're not lawyers. We know enough about the law that we can do 95% of those things, and then we defer out where we need to.
Yeah.
But having really solid vendor relationships and really good resources to aid our ability to help the company are vital.
Mhm.
And I personally do my own payroll at my family's company.
Yeah.
And I do it through a really fantastic resource that I get to use both there and with several of our clients at HR Elements. And
Mhm.
they take a lot of the tax and accounting and heavy lifting off of me. And then I can focus on doing orientation and initial federal and state tax forms with the employee, and then do all the entries that Jamie talked about before, and then actually run the payroll. And
Yeah.
then we would send all those reports over to our accounting team, and then they take the next step,
Yeah.
entering that into their P&L and manipulating and working with any data they need to make financial decisions.
Interesting. That's good. I never really thought of it from that perspective. One of the biggest problems that you face when you're trying to create a podcast is the lack of time to make your podcast great. It takes hours of your time to plan, record, and edit, and then eventually post your content. Here at the Cincinnati Podcast Studio, we help brands and entrepreneurs build their own podcast with services from planning to posting. We've got you covered. So come to our studio located in downtown Cincinnati and let us help you plan your show, coach you on how to be a great host, record, edit, and post your show. If you're interested in starting your own show, check us out at cincinnatipodcaststudio.com. In some ways, HR as a talent is how to delegate well in a way, because you guys are saying, hey, these are all the things we know a lot about, and there's some things we just can't do all of. And so you can say, hey, here's the accounting. You guys start taking over in this place. Hey, let's talk to the lawyer about this one because this is beyond our scope. This is like, I think that's actually a very valuable thing to know, because a lot of people don't know where their limits are.
I think where we've
Right.
become a good business partner is that we're in many ways a generalist. Like we have information and knowledge about many of those things to a degree. And we just know you have to have a keen sense of where the boundary is, and then know, okay, I've done what I can do up to here. I've researched what I can to get as much information and knowledge as possible to make an informed decision. What is missing? What are the puzzle pieces? Okay, I know I need to look elsewhere. And that's the time that I engage with the vendor.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So then let's get really practical here. So if I'm thinking about the stages of a small business, there are three most scared. I put up 4 fingers for that. There are 3 probably scariest moments that you guys may have some input on that I'm curious about. It would be starting the business from the very beginning, hiring your first employee, and then firing your first employee.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So I'm curious. Let's go through each of those.
Sure.
Starting your own business. When you first start a business for the very first time, are there any considerations that someone should be aware of from an HR perspective, from your guys' perspective, as they're thinking about running this business and starting it?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think it goes without saying, we've already talked about it, of course, making sure that you're doing your business registry, that you're getting your EIN for taxes, that you're getting those kind of check the box things so that you can actually operate and hire an employee. But I think it's then really sitting down and thinking about, okay, what do I want the employee experience to be like? Because you kind of need to have at least some type of an idea of that before you try to hire one. and then you don't know. Maybe it's something that you bring on your first employee, you kind of figure it out together. But it's knowing like, okay, do I want to be all in office? Do I want to be hybrid? Do I want my employees to come to me with every little issue? How do I want them to communicate with me? How do I want them to engage with our clients? Like, it's just that those little types of things that I think really help craft kind of the beginning of your culture. And then it's going to get more and more cemented with each new team member that you add. I don't know. Would you add anything to that?
Only to extend beyond it. Just like, I think what we're talking about is mission, vision, values.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think we could stress enough how critical it is, even from the get-go when you have no employees. If you're an entrepreneur and starting a company, what's your purpose? You know, you might be selling a product, you might be providing a service, but what is your differentiator? And what is your long-term strategy? What are your values that create the culture that is to become when you do bring those people on? Because in the absence of those things, people are going to create their own narratives. We've said that before, right? It's thematic, right? In the absence of expectation, people create their own narrative.
Yeah.
So you can be the person to create that. Literally write it down, mission, vision, values, and let your employees know this is how we operate, not only on paper, but be the example of that.
Yeah.
So I think that is the best way, if you're going to start a business from the ground up, to ensure that your employees are in alignment with your own goal. It'll make them so much happier because they'll know where the bar is and they know what's expected of them. And as you bring people on, it won't just become, the chaos that sometimes often ensues in quickly growing organizations where that might not exist.
You said that way better than.
Oh,
I'm glad
you said it fantastically.
Yeah,
but we've both seen like organizations where they don't do it.
No.
And it's a mess. And it's not that they meant for it to be a mess. It's just it's sometimes like when you're so in the business, you don't work on the business. And as the CEO, the leader, and the HR director, you all can play a role in that, but it requires stepping away and not being buried in payroll paperwork,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think the other thing, like that mission, vision, values, really the values then kind of are that compass with which you really use to decide, what do I want my policies to be like? Right? Because if you say that you're flexible, but then you must be in the office 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. Why? Because that's not flexible, right? Like you have to figure it out, and you need to make sure that you're being consistent. I think, and so frequently we'll work with organizations, and we have a lot of turnover, or people are frustrated with this, that, or the other, and it all does sometimes go back to that handbook, and we're like, well, what are your values? How are you making these decisions? And it's not because we're trying to be fluffy or talk about feelings. It's because that's the compass with which you make business decisions.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And so that's a big piece of it.
That's a great
Well,
point.
that's why when we started our studio, one of our values was we're a great hang. Like we are
a great hang.
I know, isn't that fun?
I know. I
but
love
like
it.
when we think about hiring our first employee, that's going to be the conversation. Like, are you good with people? Because our job is to be good with people, make them comfortable, and then let them do their show. So I see the total value in that. That's a great perspective. Having that mission, vision, values, like that is a key starting point that people seem to overlook sometimes. They're just like, I'm good at doing a thing. I want to do that.
Yeah.
And it doesn't set them up for success very well when they want to hire their first employee.
Right. Yep.
So when you're getting to that point, that feels like, for me, that feels like one of the scariest steps, because I've been in I've started businesses before. I've had to fire people before. I've never had to hire somebody before, like into my own company. And so I'm curious, like, what are some watch outs? What are some things to pay attention to when you're starting to say, okay, now's the time. Let's hire somebody.
Let's start with the job description.
You go first.
Right? Job
Let's start
description.
there.
You got it. You got it. Let's start with the JD. So,
Not a law degree, huh?
Right. Not a law degree.
Not a
That's
law
right.
degree.
We don't
The
need it, but
job
we
description.
appreciate them and we utilize them. So I mentioned before, in the absence of expectation, people write their own narrative.
Mhm.
So job descriptions are like the first thing an employee generally sees about the company. They go online, they look for job postings, they see that job description. So
Mm.
that tells you this is what this job is. Now, you can write a whole bunch of things and it's all these things that you think the employee's going to do, and then the job description is something totally different. So I think the thing you want to be mindful of when you're writing a job description is, what is it that you really want this person to do? And you don't need to write out every little detail. You can't. It's not exhaustive.
Mhm.
So having a really good job description that is truly a reflection of what the role is your first step. Having a really good conversation at the interview process about what the expectation is for the role is a really excellent second step.
Mm.
If you're in a company that's hiring its first employee, you're in startup mode. You're in entrepreneurial mentality. You're going to need an employee that feels and thinks entrepreneurially, unless you're looking for someone that you want to take over perhaps the more administrative types of things. But even then, that role is going to evolve. I would let the employee know at that point, here's what the role is now. Here's how it can evolve. Here's how we might adjust pay and other kinds of compensation benefit, whatever, to reward you for those changes. That's a really excellent starting point.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mm.
set the expectations.
Mm.
Yeah. Definitely the job description. A methodology for paying that person. You need to
Yep.
have that figured out. You want to know, again, thinking about just kind of like the tactical forms, right? Making sure that you have there's conference,
Yeah.
making sure that you're prepared to set up taxes, that you have a good payroll vendor or a payroll process. Just kind of those nuts and bolts. Form I-9. We've been talking about that a little bit in
Mm.
a different way, just in recent news, right? When we
Yes.
think about immigration, but that pieces of paper,
I was about to
it's
say, I don't think it's just one page.
don't we
No.
wish, right?
For the most part, it is, but there's a couple, and there's the instructions are
The instructions.
long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Long.
Yes.
That document is time. It is
Mm.
required regardless of how big you are.
Mm.
And it gets messed up probably more times than it is actually completed properly.
Mm.
And so just being ready to do that and have that process. Again, there's a lot of tactical things. I think that's more check the box. You must do it so that you can properly pay. And are you going to provide benefits?
Yeah.
What types of benefits are you going
Yeah.
to provide? How are you going to get those?
Mhm.
Those are really important questions to have the answers to before you even set out to interview. I think in addition to really that job description.
Yeah.
And then it's really, I think, when you're hiring an employee, it's a lot of this is all about setting expectations. But
Mm.
then it's, what type of a manager am I going to be? Right? How
Right.
often do I want to talk to my employee about their performance? How often do I want my employee to come to me during the day? What are the types of things that I want my employee to come to me with or not? So
Mm.
that person has clarity in their role, clarity in how they're supposed to function on a day in, day out basis, and knows really kind of like the rules of the road. If Brian, you want people here by 9:30 and somebody's not going to be here by 9:30, how are they supposed to tell you? Do you want
Yeah.
a text message? Do you want an email? What is that?
Interesting.
And so
Yeah.
it's like, it's a lot of little things that you need to do a little bit of soul searching for. Kind of, it's like, how am I going to manage?
Mm.
Mhm.
Interesting. Yeah. And then, like you've been talking about this whole time, clarity. The
Yeah.
more you can provide that clarity for the employee, the better your chances are of success in that space.
And it's okay to not have all the answers now. You
Yeah.
you just aren't. It's
Yeah.
not realistic. But I think we're talking a little bit about vulnerability before the podcast, and I think there's a lot of value in letting the employee know, you know what, things are going to change as we go along. I might not have all the answers, but I want us to have open and honest communication and regular touch points with each other,
Mhm.
so that as things evolve, that we can, we know where the needle's moving to.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and I think that takes some vulnerability to feel like uh, I have to be honest and tell the employee, I just don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
We're gonna figure it out, and you're gonna be a partner with me
Yeah.
as we do that. So thank you for your
Yeah.
help as you move along. And I think that sets a really solid tone because the employee is engaged because you are in partnership with them.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Man, okay. So we're moving right along here. We're
Okay.
already close to the end of the show here. So I
We've
really
had
want
too
to
much
hit
fun. Oh my
this
goodness.
has been great. I
Yeah.
know. This is awesome.
Uh-huh.
So let's get to the scariest, maybe for some people,
Okay.
firing your first employee.
Yeah.
There's a lot of rules around that sort of thing. And there's a
Mhm.
lot of like CYA and
Yeah.
other things that have to happen. So walk us through like what to think about when potentially having to approach that situation.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So, the first thing is, what I think most people think us nerdy HR people's favorite word is, right? Documentation. So when somebody isn't performing their role well, they should not learn about it for the first time when you're telling them they don't have a job with you anymore.
Yes.
Right?
Mhm.
It is all, again, clarity, setting expectations. That is why the job description is so important,
Mhm.
right? We need to have this document of what excellent or successful performance looks like so that somebody can then do that, perform. When things aren't meeting expectations, the obligation of the manager is to communicate that to the employee and to say, look, this isn't going well. Here's how it needs to happen, or you need to stop doing that behavior, whatever that is. Do you have questions? How can I help you? So it's that constant coaching and engagement, which is absolutely the duty of the manager.
Mhm.
So once that has happened and either the employee is not improving, sometimes they're not capable, right? Maybe it was a bad hire. That's an opportunity to then sit down and have that exit discussion. Now, things I think that are important in this discussion is, time and place, always. Safety is a huge piece of it for everybody. And then I think dignity is a really big piece of it, right? That can be pretty embarrassing. That's a sad day for that person. And so I think it's important that you have an environment where you can have a private discussion. Make sure that they're able to exit if there are other people around with dignity, but that they also have information for their next step, right? When do my benefits end? When is my last paycheck going to come? What do I need to do if I move to tell the company?
Yeah.
Do I need to file for unemployment? Are you going to give me a decent reference? And then there's also sometimes an expectation from employees that you have to give me severance. And that's not true, right? That's a choice, and that is not something that is expected or should be expected, especially if I think it's a performance issue. But we want to make sure that we are also, if it's an employer with more than one employee, that there's that fairness and consistency. And that's typically when somebody like Warren or myself is going to be able to get involved and say, okay, well, let's talk about, the specifics of this situation, but then also let's look across your employee population to make sure that this person may be based on their age or their race or a disability, right? That they are being treated in a way that's consistent and that this is a decision that's purely being made because of performance. It always goes back to performance of the job.
Interesting. I think then my follow-up question to that would be, how do you document well in the process of like, how would you counsel managers to have good conversations with these employees so that they are not surprised?
So that's exactly it. Is a lot of HR directors, when you're so bogged down in the minutia sometimes, or allow yourself to get to that space, that we forget that our managers are frontline advocates for the work that we collectively do together to manage processes like that. So I have worked with managers to showcase to them, here are examples of things that might come up in the work that you do with your employee that you may need to be doing some documentation on. Here's a good example of what documentation looks like. Some key elements are to think about documentation from a very objective standpoint. Date, time. When did the incident or whatever needs documenting, disciplinary issue, when did that happen? Quotes, actions. What
Mhm.
specifically did the employee do? What did the employee say? What did the employee not
Mm.
do? What policy was violated? Um, those things need to be written out in narrative form. And then where's the pathway to success for the employee? So
Mm.
a large part of documentation people sort of forget about is there's a learning opportunity
Mhm.
here. We as an HR professionals and managers are really educators, right? We're here to help the employee do well. It's to their own betterment and to the success of the business that they do so. So we want for them to be aware, you're going to take XYZ step in
Mm.
order to do this differently next time or change this, or, next time, we messed up this process and it cost the company a lot of money, whatever.
Mm.
Maybe we need to counsel you through, this is how to do it in the future. And let's
Mhm.
work on it together step by step. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now there are more serious things that might happen, like sexual harassment, discrimination, that
Mhm.
oftentimes result in um, termination more quickly than most. But there's still learning opportunities through that too. We
Mhm.
want to create a culture where those things are not accepted, but where can the learning happen so the employee knows this is not acceptable, and
Yeah.
what remedial training might we engage the employee in to ensure that we're also, culturally
Mm.
uh, helping people understand that whether you're here at the company or just out and about with other people, that we have expectation for our society that we operate from an appropriate standpoint.
Mhm.
Mm. So then I have actually had to deal with this once in the
Mhm.
past with a direct report of mine.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious what your guys' perspectives are. Say you get a report around sexual harassment or
Mhm.
discrimination. What are good things to just immediately start doing? Like what are you supposed to do as a manager in those moments?
Mhm. So if you're a manager who's lucky enough to have an HR resource, right,
Mhm.
you call that HR professional and tell them what's going on. They're going to guide you every step of the way. If you don't, maybe you call HR Elements and we help you.
Look at that. The plug. I love it.
Lovely.
But if that supervisor did call me, what I would be saying is, tell me about the two people that are involved in this, right? If the person who is being potentially victimized, we need to separate, right? And the
Mhm.
first step is making sure that the person who is the alleged victim should not be inconvenienced, which means that
Mhm.
person does not have a scheduling change. That person doesn't have to do anything different. So that could potentially require putting the person who's being accused of harassing or discriminating behavior on a suspension pending investigation, right? So immediate separation. And then it is a process of conducting an investigation. The one thing, and I wanted to say this earlier when we were talking about hiring the person, doing an interview, same rule applies, I think, for an investigation is you don't just go sit down with your blank yellow legal pad to say, "So tell me what happened," right? You want to go into your interview with specific questions. You
Mm.
want to prep for your investigation based on what you were told. You need to understand date, time, place, specifics, witnesses, who was involved, um, and really get the nitty gritty. And it can be uncomfortable, right? You're
Mhm.
going to come up, you're going to have to talk about potentially really maybe offensive or uncomfortable content. But you need to know exactly what is happening so that you can really understand, gosh, what are my potential pathways to eliminating this issue?
Mm.
And then once you feel as though you've done your due diligence, you've spoken to any potential witnesses that were listed, you've gotten the good, notes of what has occurred, then it's really looking at your values. What are your policies? What is appropriate for in your business and what isn't?
Mm.
I think it's pretty difficult for there to be a legitimate, purposeful, discriminatory, or harassing situation where the person who was demonstrating those behaviors is welcomed back into the workplace without there being an issue. With others involved. It may be an exit process if those things were occurring. But, again, going into it, getting the truth and finding out what happened before that person is able to come back to work or, re-engage with the victim.
And a rule of thumb, I like to, before I enter into any investigation, I do like to just go back, even though I know it, I just like to go back and read our policy and see our process. It's really important that we're following those things. If what ultimately becomes negative outcomes for somebody in that process are often the times where people get litigious, and when you're dealing with their lawyers and your lawyers, and we want to be certain that we're following whatever we said we would do in our handbook. And so we were talking about pitfalls earlier. That's a very common pitfall, is having all these policies and then not following them. And, how often are you looking at your sexual harassment investigation policy? Probably not that often, maybe once a year.
Hopefully never have to.
Hopefully you don't have to.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hopefully you don't have to, but inevitably you just do. And we've all been through those. So reading through that, ensuring, making a little outline to know that we've knocked out everything that we need to knock out, is very important.
It actually made me think of something else.
Oh, okay.
When you're starting your business, what
Yeah.
do you need to do, right? Before you hire an employee, you need to have an additional resource, or you should. You don't have to. You should. That if they are having a problem with you, right, the manager, the owner, and there's nobody else, right? It's that first employee. If something is happening and they need help, who should they go to?
Yeah.
It's really a great best practice to just have somebody available, because I think it sets the expectation of, look, I don't think you're ever going to have to utilize this service because my style is X, Y, and Z, but I want you to know that I care. And so if you need a lifeline, if you need somebody to talk to, here's a great trusted resource. Call them if you need them.
That's actually really smart. I worked at an organization that had one something like that. That was like a phone number to a place called like Lighthouse or something like that. Like, the funny thing though about the organization was they didn't tell anyone it existed.
Oh, yikes!
And so it's like,
no good.
that would have been good to know.
Resource.
Yeah, I know,
Excellent.
a secret resource. Shoot. Oh well, but man, guys, this has been amazing. We've run out of time. This is awesome. Thank you for all of your insight, your wisdom. I know that this is a space that I am completely ignorant of. So I'm grateful for all of your advice that you guys have given today. So I'm going to put one of you guys on the spot.
Okay.
All right. Whoever wants to do it can give a 30-second pitch for your business, for HR Elements. Who wants to do it?
You're the pro.
Oh gosh.
You're the pro.
Okay.
You're the pro. Okay. So
Which
that camera right there, the second from the right,
Okay,
that one is you.
Okay.
So give a 30-second pitch. Tell people how they can get in contact with you.
Well, the best way to reach us is by going to our website, which is hrelements.com. You will know that you're there because you'll see Warren and I on the homepage. And you can also contact us via LinkedIn or by emailing info@hrelements.com. And you'll be able to reach out to me via that email, and we will follow up within 24 hours to give you the access and support that you need.
Awesome. That was great. You
Thank
did a
you.
great job for
Well,
last
fantastic.
minute. I appreciate it. Well done. Seriously, guys, Warren, Jamie, thank you so much for being here today. I think everyone will find this a valuable conversation because I think it's just ignored by so many. So thank you, thank you, and appreciate it.
Thank you
Thanks
for your
for
time,
having
Brian.
us.
Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks so much for listening to the Cincinnati Business Podcast. If you like the show, the best way to support us is to like, comment, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you fantastic content just like this. And if you are a greater Cincinnati-based business owner who has something you want to share with the world, reach out to me at brian@cincinnatipodcaststudio.com.